during the day. So I'm very excited. So each panel will kind of represent a different chunk of the theme. What I want you to hear, and I actually mean this as a big thank you, today really would not be possible without Richard and Susan Smith, and without the Richard and Susan Smith Family Foundation. They've really helped us do this learning and help us think about how we can start to share this material. But before I go any further, I want to introduce the Dean of Harvard Law School, a really long-time friend of Facing History and ourselves, somebody who has taught me so much, both in the room, but also with her books. I always think that I'm having a relationship with her books, and then I get to see her every once in a while. So this is Martha Minow. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome. And it is a tremendous joy to welcome you all and this great event here at Harvard Law School. I am indeed a great friend of Facing History and Ourselves, because Facing History and Ourselves is a great friend to me and to my work and to my students. James Lovell, the astronaut, once said, "There's some people who make things happen. There's some people who watch things happen. And then there are some people who say, 'What happened?'" Facing History makes things happen, and I know that today will be no exception. I do, of course, in the spirit of Facing History, have a critique already. We haven't even started. And that is that the title of this event is terrific, Reimagining Self and Other. It imagines, however, that we're already in the midst of it. And I hope by the end of the day, we've reached a point of imagine self and other, the injunction to do so. While you are here, please enjoy this space. There is down the hall a room filled with quotations about justice. They are different views of justice. If you want to have a break, go take a look. I am sure we will have different views today about self and other, and I look forward to the conversation. Welcome.
Thanks, Martha. Martha, beyond being like an intellectual guide, literally helped us get to space. So this is a big deal, too. So I have the honor also of introducing another friend of Facing History that I actually didn't meet first. Margot Strom and Mark Skoversky, who are both here somewhere, I don't know where y'all are, met Anthony Appia now. Anthony, I think it's been 20 plus years ago. And actually, Anthony was involved in a conference that Martha actually helped to organize a while ago. So Anthony, I've asked to do something that I think is hard work, but I also know that Anthony can do it. I said, before we really get into these different panels, I need somebody to give us kind of an ethical and moral overview of the questions that we're going to be exploring. So I told Anthony he's got to give me a little sermon here, or a little something to meditate on. So Anthony is a philosopher. He's at Princeton. He was here at Harvard. He's the author most recently of a really, really good book called The Honor Code. Not to say that the other books aren't good, but I keep coming back to it. So Anthony, let me turn things over to you.
Thanks very much. I say I've already spent 5 seconds. Well, Adam said who I am, so I don't have to introduce myself. I want to talk about the ethics of diversity, and I want to begin by framing this by talking about what I mean by ethics, because when you talk about ethics, normally people behave as if you're going to wag your finger at them and tell them how to behave towards other people. But the core question of ethics, as Aristotle, who wrote the first great book in ethics, that is the first great book that has the word ethics in the title, the problem that Aristotle was interested in wasn't in the first place about treating other people. It was about how to think about what it is for a human life to go well. What is it for people to flourish, to have what he called eudaimonia? That's sometimes translated as happiness. That's a terrible translation because it makes it sound like something very sort of subjective. Whereas Aristotle was asking the question, what is it for a human being to live a successful life? And I want to just begin with 3 ethical ideas, 3 parts of the answer to the question of ethics, the central question of ethics being, what is it for a human life to go well? First principle, everybody matters. You may think this is obvious, but it hasn't been regarded as obvious always. We live in a world in which large numbers of people are being treated as if they didn't matter. In the ancient world, indeed in Aristotle's time, Aristotle talks about the community. He's basically talking about free men. He's not talking about the women. He's not talking about the slaves. They had slaves in democratic Athens. He's thinking about, and when he talks about flourishing, he's actually, if you look at the examples, they're all about the flourishing of free adult males. So even though perhaps at some level Aristotle understood that everybody matters, he didn't really live up to it. And it's a very important fundamental ethical idea, everybody matters. That's a significant part of the sermon, is to remember that that's what we should think. Second, dignity matters. And I don't have a lot of time to sort of do the philosophical deep work on this, but let me just say that to say that we must respect everybody in their dignity, I think means that we've got to bear in mind the facts about people that are relevant to figuring out how we should treat them. And I'll get back in a second to saying a bit more about that. And the third thing is that in the end, everybody matters, but also everybody is fundamentally in charge of their own life. People have to be living their own lives for themselves. We have to create a society, we have to create a state, we have to create a world in which each person is entitled, is enabled to live his or her own life, manage it for herself. Not, of course, a life without others, not a life without interconnection, not an unsociable life, but still a life in which I am in charge of mine and you are in charge of yours. All right, just to go back to the second thing again, I said the second idea is that we have to respect everybody in their dignity. And I said that meant that we've got to figure out what facts about people matter when we're thinking about how to treat them. Well, here are some things. They can suffer. And suffering is bad, and so we should do what we can to minimize it. They need food and drink, so we've got to make sure that everybody's adequate nutrition and water. These are important things. They need friendship and love, and the big thing, everybody's making a life, right? That was the central topic of Aristotle. What is it for your life to go well? Everybody's doing that, and that's one of the things we have to bear in mind when we decide how we're going to treat people. All right. And first fact, as it were, among the tools we have for making our lives are, of course, our talents, our educations, but our identities. Our identities, we're going to be talking about identity today. Identities are among the tools with which we make our lives. We make our lives as men, as women. We make our lives as Americans, as Ghanaians, as Canadians. We make our lives as gay people, as straight people. We make our lives as Jews and Gentiles, Catholics, Muslims. And these identities are tools in the creation of this life which ethics says we have to evaluate. We have to ask about my life, what is it for it to go well? All right. How do identities work? I want to just say, first of all, we create labels. I've just given you some labels. Gay, straight, male, female, American, Canadian, Catholic, Muslim. These are the labels. And these labels go with ideas about, first, who should be carrying them, who should bear them, who are the Muslims, who are the gay people, who are the Americans. And second, ideas about what being an American or a Muslim means you should do in your life, ideas in particular that you will be guided by, so that I think of myself as an American, I think that gives me reasons to do things. As an American, it's my job, for example, to keep track of what my president is doing and to make sure that it's decent. And that if it isn't decent, I and my friends get together and try and pull him back in a decent direction. They go with ideas, finally, of course, about how we should treat other people. When you think of someone as an American and you are an American, you think of her as a fellow citizen. That affects how you treat her. If you're a Muslim and you think of somebody else as a Muslim, that's a fellow Muslim. You are together members of the community of Islam. You have obligations of solidarity as a Muslim, as an American, as a Jew, and so on. So that's what identities are. And these ideas about how you apply the label, what it means to people, how people should be treated, these ideas are communicated in society through the ways we respond to each other, and including, of course, the things we say. You're a black person. You should be in favor of affirmative action, we say. Right? We're telling someone that in virtue of their identity, they have a certain obligation. And we do that sort of thing all the time. You're a man. You shouldn't be in that dress. Right? Men don't wear dresses. Right? except in Scotland and Greece, where the most macho men wear skirts because that's what the official dress of the Greek army is a skirt. So we're constantly being reinforced with these ideas, but people are saying you've got to believe in affirmative action, you're black, you've got to take that dress off, you're a man, but these ideas are contested. There are African Americans who have a principled objection to affirmative action. I don't agree with them, but they're entitled to that. As we know, used to be the case that one of the ways in which the rule against men wearing dresses was enforced was by the law. You could be imprisoned if you were a man in a dress. Well, we don't do that anymore, and there always have been, and there still are some men who want, some people who are, as it were, biologically men, some people who are biologically men who are transvestites, and that's they're contesting the idea. They're fighting against the idea, and all of these things are contested. We contest about who the label applies to. You're not a good Muslim. In fact, you're not really a Muslim at all, right? That's contest about the label. There's contest about what it means to be a Muslim. I say I'm a Muslim, I'm entitled to have 4 wives. Another Muslim, say, no, you're only allowed to have 4 wives if you can really afford to love and cherish them. And you can't love and cherish all 4 of them, right? So we have a contest about what the rules are, about what the meaning is of Islam in the life of good Muslims. And, of course, we have contest all the time about how you should treat people of different identities, right? I mean, in America we know this. We've had a couple of centuries of struggle about how black and white people should relate to one another, how the people who are the descendants of the migrants who came here after Columbus should treat the people whose ancestors have been here for tens of thousands of years, the Native Americans, the Indians. All right. So just take quickly, I've been talking about men in dresses. Masculinity is a good example here. That is to say, being a man is something that is ideas about what it is to be a man are communicated all the time. There are disagreements about who the men are. Some people think that F2M transsexuals aren't men, and some people think they are. I'm not taking sides in that. I'm just pointing out that there's a disagreement. There's disagreement about what it means to be a man, and indeed, when I was a young person, if you were a man, a well-educated young man, you opened doors for women, right? And when I got to college and I joined I was a medical student the first year in college, and I was the only man who joined the women's group of the medical school, and after a while they asked me to leave for obvious reasons. But I was very interested in what they were doing, and they, among other things, taught me to see that when you do that, when you open a door for every woman about whom you know nothing except that she's a woman, you're sort of implying that men have to make the world safe for women, that men are the people who sort of allow women to get around. And that's a condescending message. And so we have disagreements about what men should do because they're men. And we have disagreements about how people should be treated in virtue of the fact that they're men and that they're women. That, I just gave an example of that as well. So all of these things are contested, and we have dialogue in our societies about how to do these things. Now, I want to just announce that I think there are some principles that we can think about in this area. One is, the first one that I got up here, is nobody's entitled to fix the meaning of an identity on their own. Identities are social. We make them together. So I can't just I hereby declare that being a man means such and such. I hereby declare that men can wear dresses. Well, I can't do that. If I want to change the meaning of an identity, it's a social process. It involves politics. It involves dealing with other people. It involves getting organized, getting together, thinking together, raising consciousness, and moving along. So you can't do it on your own. It doesn't make sense to do it on your own. They're intrinsically social. They're intrinsically things that are produced together. Second, nevertheless, we have in the modern world, I think, a powerful idea, which is that if a label is working in the lives of some people, then that's the community that should have primary charge over what it should mean. So when Jesse Jackson told us, Americans, that colored Americans, Negroes, wanted to be called African Americans, wanted to stress in thinking about their identity a connection with an ancestral continent, people rightly thought, well, I mean, to the extent that he's successfully speaking for an African American community, they have the right to invite us to speak of them in this way. It's not up to us non-African Americans to make decisions about what people. If that's what they want, then that's what we're going to do. So, of course, primary role. All of these identities are social. They're all negotiated by the insiders and the outsiders. It mattered when Jesse Jackson wanted people to call black people African Americans. It mattered that he was talking to everybody. He wasn't just talking to black people. He wasn't saying we should call ourselves African Americans. He was trying to reshape the way in which both the insiders and the outsiders were thinking about the meaning of their identity. And finally, at the level of the individual, each of us has the right to figure out our own way, nevertheless, despite the fact that we don't own the identities. Nevertheless, we have the right to figure out our own way of fitting these identities into our lives. Each of us has to figure out, for example, what kind of man or what kind of woman we're going to be. And each of us is a man or a woman in our own way. We each have, the great German philosopher of the 18th century said, we each have our own measure. We each have our own way of doing everything. And we have our own way, in particular, of being men, of being women, of being black, of being white, being Catholic, Muslim, Jewish. All of these, we have the right to figure out what it's going to do in my life. Is it important to me that I'm black? If it is, how is it important to me? I can't determine the social meaning of being black, but I can decide for myself how to fit it into my life, and I'm entitled to. So individuals don't own identities, but they do have the right to figure out how to fit them into their lives, because principle 3 of ethics, everybody is fundamentally in charge of his or her own life. So that means we're going to enter a world in which people have diverse identities because they need them to make their lives. As I said, they make their lives as men and women and Muslims and Americans. And they not only have diverse identities for the reasons I just gave, they're entitled to have diverse identities. They're entitled to make their lives in their own way. They're entitled to fit their identities into their lives in the ways that make sense to them. And that's the world we enter. We have to enter a world where we accept this. They have to make the best sense they can of the identities that are out there. I arrived in a world in which masculinity was already in place, but I have to make my own sense of it. And if you're up for it, if you're up for the social project of doing it, you have the right to try and invent new identities. And people do that all the time. Punk, right? Goth. These are new identities. Gay was a new identity once, or at least it was a transformation, a very radical transformation of an old identity, a sort of identity as a queer, or a medicalized identity as a homosexual. Gay was a new identity, and people, but that wasn't produced by one person waking up in the morning and saying, I hereby invent an identity, this is what it means. It was produced by a social process, by a lesbian and gay movement. And the fact that the world is full of diverse identities and that people are entitled to them and entitled to make their own lives with them means that it imposes demands on the rest of us. Because if each person is entitled to make her own life, and if that you need to make your own life as a person of diverse identities, various identities, then we should make that possible for each other. Right? We should try and create a state and a society that enables people to do the one big thing that everybody is doing, which is making a life. And we should do that, we should allow them to do that in a way that makes sense, and the way that makes sense involves recognizing that each of us is going to mobilize social identities in our thinking about who we are, what life we're making. And of course, we don't always do this. We don't do always what we should. We haven't always made states and societies that were open to allowing people to make the best sense of their lives by taking the available social identities and fitting them into their own lives. We have used identities to place what I'm calling here cramping limits on other people. And that's what anti-Semitism does. That's what Islamophobia does. That's what racism and sexism and homophobia do. They take an identity from the outside, they, as it were, boss people around, and they turn this thing which should be a possible source of positivity and meaning in their lives, and they impose negative consequences on it, negative meaning on it. They get in the way of people making the best sense of their own lives in terms of the identities they have. Now, the problem here isn't responding to people as having identities. I've said that's a good thing. The problem is responding in the wrong way. Responding in a way that turns identities, which can be positive sources of meaning, helps in making our lives, turning them into something that demeaning or disabling or that gets in the way of making the best life for yourself. And that's the real problem. So we're going to learn today some of the ways in which studying history, studying sociology, studying psychology, studying law can help us to understand the obstacles there are to doing this thing that I said we must do, which is accept that people have diverse identities and help to create a world in which we can live with them. We're going to take these various sources of scholarship and bring them to bear on the question how we can get the obstacles out of the way, get rid of the obstacles, so that people can live lives of meaning in which their identities are sources of flourishing, which is a good translation, by the way, of Aristotle's word eudaimonia. It's a better one than happiness. We need to do that. We need to take the intellectual resources of our wonderful time. We live in a time of fantastic scholarly attention to identity, as well as a world in which identity is a source of course, of great trouble and difficulty as well. In this time, we have these resources. We can take them and help to try and get these obstacles that have historically gotten in the way of people making identity a positive part of their lives, and on the other hand, turn it around and make it possible to create a world in which everybody has access to a range of identities that they can use in the project of constructing their own individual life. And we are going to be talking about the obstacles, but I want to remind you in closing that we know how to do this. We already know how to do this. You deal with your mother, your sister, your wife as a woman. Treating a woman respectfully isn't a matter of forgetting that she's a woman. It isn't a matter of putting the fact that she's a woman out of the way. It isn't the fact of ignoring her identity as a woman. It's responding to it in a respectful and appropriate and a thoughtful and a decent way. It's allowing her being a woman to be something she can use in her own way to make her own life. We know how to do that. As I say, we do it with our wives and our sisters and our mothers all the time. We know how to do it. Not always with our mothers. Sometimes we fail with our mothers. But we can do it with our mothers, and we should do it with our mothers, and we know we should be doing it. And as I say, what we know is it isn't done by forgetting that she's a woman. And similarly, you don't treat Jews respectfully by forgetting that they're Jews. You don't treat Muslims respectfully by forgetting that they're Muslims. You don't put their identities out of the way. You take them on board and you work with them to understand what those identities mean to them in their lives, and help them to live a life in which their identities are sources of positivity and meaning, so that they can do this one great thing that we're all doing, which is making a life.
What I asked him to do, which is lay out the big philosophical, ethical, and moral imperatives as we start to think about encountering the other and encountering ourselves, right? And so in this session, we're going to be thinking about the psychology of difference. And I'm really, really honored. There are two people that are new to Facing History, but three people that I've never met before the last couple of days. So I'm very excited. The first is Michael Inzlicht. Michael's come here from the University of Toronto, and like everybody else who flew in last night, really, really delayed. So I really appreciate it. And the second is a woman who's worked with Michael, actually, at the University of Toronto, but about to become a Bostonian, actually Cantabrigian, Jennifer Gutzel. And then the last speaker is Binna Kandola, and Binna's actually, he flew the farthest. He's flown in from the UK, and is here for 36 hours, so be really kind to Binna as we start to think about the psychology of difference, so from the philosophy. So 36 years ago when Facing History started, so many of our ideas about difference and prejudice were informed by the work of Gordon Allport. Where have we gone since Gordon Allport's work? And I think that's what you'll be introduced to new ideas from that. But I also want to say, it's not just new. This is Facing History's work for a long time. So I asked a good friend of mine, Doc Miller, who's a longtime Facing History teacher and a staff member, to read a resource from a poem from the Facing History resource book, Race and Membership in the United States. Take it away, Doc. And I got to go that way.
What Do We Do with a Variation by James Barrie. What do we do with a difference? Do we stand and discuss its oddity, or do we ignore it? Do we shut our eyes to it, or poke it with a stick? Do we clobber it to death? Do we move around it in a rage and enlist the rage of others? Do we will it to go away? Do we look at it in awe or purely in wonderment? Do we work for it to disappear? Do we pass it stealthily or change route away from it? Do we will it to become like ourselves? What do we do with the difference? Do we communicate to it? Let application acknowledge it for barriers to fall down.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Michael Inslicht, and today I'll be talking to you about these thoughts that we have in our head about people, about groups of people, these stereotypes that we have about these groups of people, and how they may be in our minds and other people's minds, but they're very real. They have real consequences in terms of achievement, in terms of behavior, and perhaps even in terms of health. Neil deGrasse Tyson, when he gave his commencement address in 1991, was only the 7th black astrophysicist out of 4,000 astrophysicists in the United States. And in his commencement address, he said the following: "In the perception of society, my athletic talents are genetic. I am a likely mugger rapist, and my academic failures are expected. To spend most of my life fighting these attitudes levies an emotional tax that is a form of intellectual emasculation." Now, what deGrasse Tyson is saying here is that he has fought stereotypes, these thoughts that people have about him and his group his entire life. And these thoughts had impact. They affected his behavior. They affected his performance, and perhaps they acted as a kind of emotional tax, as a strong headwind that prevented him from reaching his full potential. Now imagine yourself a young Neil deGrasse Tyson in the hallways of an esteemed Ivy League university, and people have these thoughts about you, that, about what you are capable of, about what you're not capable of. Maybe they look at you, and because of the color of your skin, they think, what is this person doing here? Shouldn't this person be on the football field, the basketball court? Not in Columbia, right? Now imagine what it would be like for you, sitting there taking a test, knowing that people have these thoughts floating in their heads about you. Do you think you'd perform at your full potential? What happens when you leave the school setting after having coping with these thoughts that people have about you, fighting against them, and you go back to your home, back to your community? Do you think you'll act the same as someone who didn't have to fight these thoughts? Will there be consequences of having to fight these thoughts? What I want to talk to you about today is suggest yes. In fact, people who fight these stereotypes aren't playing on the same kind of level playing field and suffer consequences as a result. So these stereotypes are real, they're consequential. All right, so what do I mean by a stereotype? Let's define it. In short, you can think of it as kind of these thought bubbles that we have about groups of people. They're traits that we attribute to a group. So not just traits to any one person, but to a large group. They are widely held, consensually held by society, and they aren't necessarily true. They may be based on some small kernel of truth, but they aren't necessarily true, and they certainly aren't true when applied to any one person. Okay, so let's use Neil deGrasse Tyson's example. So now imagine we have a hypothetical white person over here who sees Neil deGrasse Tyson in the hallways, and this white person may be thinking, I wonder if this person is an athlete. Is this person violent? Is he going to be aggressive? I wonder how smart this person is. Okay, these are the kinds of thoughts that these thought bubbles that we have about, let's say, African Americans. But there are other stereotypes. In fact, many groups in society, all groups in society, have some form of stereotype or other applied to them. Can we think of any others? Well, one great source of stereotypes, of course, is the American icon Barbie. A number of years ago, Mattel produced a talking Barbie doll. And she said all kinds of cute things when you pulled the string from behind her back. All right? So you pull a string from behind her back, and she would say something like, meet me at the mall. Or maybe she would say, let's plan our dream wedding. Or how about, I love shopping. Okay? And then my favorite, math class is tough. Okay? So what you get here is a picture of the kinds of ideas that we have in society about, in this case, women, about what women are capable of and what they aren't capable of. And in this case, maybe women aren't thought to be so good in math and science, engineering, and technology. To Mattel's credit, they did eventually recall this doll, but not after acts of terrorism. There's an organization called the Barbie Liberation Organization. That was in the Bay Area, that went to toy stores, stole these Barbies from the shelves. Okay, so we know what stereotypes are. We've got some examples of some stereotypes. Are they just in the air? Are they just in people's heads? Or do they have some impact? According to some seminal work by Claude Steele and his colleagues at Stanford University, there was a phenomenon called stereotype threat. This is a situational predicament where people find themselves at risk of confirming a negative stereotype about their group. Okay? So anything they say, anything they do, perhaps can be construed in the lens of a negative stereotype. And as a result, this can be disarming. This can lead people to be aroused and nervous and upset. All right? And ultimately, it can lead to all different kinds of downstream consequences. So here's an image. I think it's a nice depiction of what stereotype threat is. It's an image of a man and woman discussing, a male and female scientists discussing, looks like science, data. And you see what's going on in the man's head, all kinds of sciencey kinds of things, talking about the data. But the woman, on the other hand, is not thinking about science. She's thinking about how she's being perceived. She's worried about being laughed at. She's worried about how she's being judged. All right? Now, we all, from time to time, worry about these things. It's not limited to, let's say, women in a science field. But for people who belong to negatively stereotyped groups, these thoughts may be more pervasive. They may be more destructive. All right? There's an extra layer of ambiguity about why the things happen to her. So is this person going to judge me because I'm a woman? Does this person have these negative thoughts about women? Am I representing all of womankind right now? That's the idea here. Now, what are the consequences of a stereotype threat? What can it lead to? Can it, for example, account for well-known participation gaps in the math and sciences? So this is some data I'm presenting here. I hope you can all see it. That shows nationally representative samples and looking at participation rates in the sciences for men and women. Now, despite women actually outnumbering men now in colleges, at least at the bachelor level, women tend to be underrepresented in the sciences, be that computer science, engineering, mathematics, physics. Can stereotype threat account for this? What about performance gaps? There are well-known race performance gaps separating blacks and whites. I don't like putting this data up there, but they are real. These are also based on data from, I believe, every state in the United States, looking at reading performance of white and black 13-year-olds. And what you see is, from when the data was recorded in 1980 till the present time, or at least till 2004, there is this gap. All right? Why is this gap there? Can stereotypes contribute to these gaps? Is that possible? So I'll show you one piece of data that may convince you, I hope, that this can be the case. So this is a study conducted by Claude Steele and Josh Aronson at an elite university, Stanford University. And in this study, what happened was black and white students came into a lab, they took a test, but right before taking the test, they did something that many of us typically do before we take, let's say, a GRE test or an SAT test. You indicate your demographics, so whether you're male or female, your race, your age, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you're indicating your race and you're black, all of a sudden race rushes to mind. You may start thinking about the things that are associated with your race. And remember what Neil deGrasse Tyson said, that his academic failures were expected. So perhaps when you think about your race and you're black, you start worrying about what people are going to think about you, whether you're going to represent your group correctly, or whether you're going to be a good ambassador of your group or not. And let's see what happens. When participants indicated their race, we see a nice large, well not nice, but a large race gap in academic performance, favoring whites. So blacks are underperforming. This is the typical kind of performance gap we've seen, similar to the one I just showed you. What about those participants who did not indicate their race, and therefore were not thinking about stereotypes, they don't have these kind of things floating in their mind? Well, all of a sudden, you see this race gap diminish, and perhaps even reverse. It's disappeared here. So perhaps this is some indication that these thoughts that are floating in our heads, floating in society, can have impact in terms of academic performance. What about other stereotypes? What about other groups? So I already talked to you about Barbie and her thoughts about females' ability in math and science. Well, a number of years ago, we asked whether women could suffer from stereotype threat and whether they could underperform as a result. And this was done at Brown University, about an hour drive from here. And what we did in this study is we simply brought women into a 3-person group and had them take a math test that you'd find, let's say, on an SAT. This time what we did is we manipulated the number of men and women in this 3-person group. Sometimes women took the test with two men on their sides. Sometimes they took it with 2 women on their sides. Sometimes there was 1 man and 1 woman, so there's kind of a mixed group. And what we found, which we thought was quite astounding, is that female math test performance fluctuated as a function of the number of men in that 3-person group. The more men there were in that group, the worse the women performed. And we also, I should say, did a similar test with verbal test performance, and we didn't find this pattern. So there's something specific about being in a minority in a math context. In this kind of context, when you're in a minority, you tend to think about the thing that makes you the minority, so in this case, being a woman. And when you think about being a woman, as you're taking a math test, maybe you start thinking about what Barbie said all those years ago. You start thinking about, hey, math class is supposed to be tough for me and my group. And that can undermine your performance. Okay? So here's again some evidence that these stereotypes that are floating in our minds are consequential. They are real. They're not just in the air. They have real impact. Okay? So I've already talked to you about 2 groups, men and women in terms of math performance, blacks and whites in terms of academics more generally. But there's been quite a bit of research documenting stereotype threat in for many different groups, be that Asian car drivers, female car drivers, white athletes compared to black athletes, the elderly in terms of memory performance, the poor in terms of academic performance more generally. All right? So these stereotypes seem to have wide impact, at least in the domains that those stereotypes impugn. All right? Now, I can't get into exact reasons about why this occurs. But modern research in neuroscience coming out of our lab and other people's labs indicates that one brain area in particular that may be involved during the phenomenon of stereotype threat is a brain area called the anterior cingulate cortex. That's this area over here where you've got this orange arrow. And this brain area does a number of things, but one thing it does is seems to be involved in self-control. It seems to be involved in volition, in willpower, in the willful control of your thoughts, behaviors, and actions. And why this may be the case during stereotype threat is that people are fighting themselves in their own minds. They're fighting against the thoughts they have. They don't want to think about the stereotypes. They don't want to worry about the stereotypes. They're also fighting against their emotions. They don't want to show any anxiety. They don't want to show any weakness. And given what we know about self-control, fighting these stereotypes, fighting these emotions can be taxing. It can be draining. And it can lead people depleted. And perhaps because they're depleted, there could be some downstream consequences that are far beyond the kinds of things I've just talked to you about. It's more than just doing poorly on a test. It's more than just not driving as well. Perhaps it can affect the fundamental ability to control your thoughts, behaviors, and actions. And then we wonder, can stereotype threat contribute to what I'm calling self-control gaps? So this is data that comes from the Center for Disease Control, again looking at tens of thousands of people. What we have here is or estimations of the extent to which black and white people engage in various kinds of activities that one could construe as reflecting self-control. So in terms of whether people exercise in the past 30 days, whites are more likely to exercise compared to blacks. Whites are more likely to eat better, as reflected in BMI. Whites are less likely to smoke compared to whites. Okay? Now, is it possible that stereotype threat contributes to these self-control deficits, I like to call them? Now, in order to address this question, I need to go on a slight tangent and tell you something very, very quick about self-control. And this is work on self-control is based on work by Roy Baumeister and his colleagues out of Florida State University, who've studied self-control for a number of years now. And they've made two claims about self-control. So first, self-control is a central resource. It underlies many different kinds of behaviors that on the surface may appear quite different, but really they're quite the same. So anything that requires volition, willpower. So, inhibiting your desire to smoke, if you're a smoker, requires willpower. Studying for an exam, when you'd rather be watching TV, checking Facebook, or doing other things, requires self-control. Eating well, when you've got delicious food in front of you, requires self-control. The second thing that Roy Baumeister and his colleagues talked about in terms of self-control, and a quite interesting aspect of self-control, is that he described self-control as being kind of like a fuel tank, a limited resource. You have some of it every morning, and as you use it to regulate your behaviors throughout the day, you have less of it and less of it and less of it and less of it, so that at the end of the day, you're fatigued, you're tired, and you're taxed. Okay? Now let's think about this in terms of stereotype threat. Let's bring it back to stereotype threat. Remember, during stereotype threat, you're worried about what people are thinking about you. Maybe you've got these emotions that are arising. You're fighting against these emotions. These things take volition. They take willpower. And if we can think of self-control in some ways as a pie, a limited pie, if you use some of that pie to fight the emotions that you have, if you use some of that to fight against the thoughts that you have, well, you won't have very much left to regulate, let's say, your eating behavior. So will you eat more after having coped with a stereotype-threatening situation? Will you lose self-control after having engaged in a stereotype-threatening situation? That's the question that I'll ask, and the short answer, at least we think, is yes. I'm describing very quick a study that we ran a number of years ago now at the University of Toronto, where we brought women into a lab. We had them take a math test where their identities as women were salient, and therefore they're thinking about negative stereotypes, versus a test where we kind of assuaged them that, you're not going to be judged on the basis of negative stereotypes. So a threatening test versus a non-threatening test. They took the test. It was all done. And then we told them, you still have 20 minutes left here. Would you mind participating in a second study? I think you'll like it. It's a marketing study where we're asking people to rate the flavors of various kinds of ice cream. Would you be interested? Everyone said yes. We then gave them 3 bowls of ice cream, and each bowl had 3 scoops of ice cream, so a lot of ice cream, 9 scoops of ice cream. And what they had to do is they simply had to taste the ice cream and then rate each flavor on a number of dimensions, okay? But really, we didn't care about what the dimension. We didn't care what the flavors were, what they thought about the flavors. We wanted to know how much they ate. All right? And we weighed the ice cream before they ate it, after they ate it. We subtracted it. We figured out how much they ate. All right? And then we looked at that. We noticed that those who took the threatening test, those who were thinking about stereotypes, fighting against stereotypes, and the emotions that come with it, ate more ice cream. They actually ate about 20 grams more ice cream than those women who did not fight those negative stereotypes. there's some indication here that these stereotypes can spill over. They can affect not just academic performance, but perhaps spill over and affect the primary ability, the basic ability to restrain one's impulses. We've done this a number of times now, and we've shown, as I just mentioned, how this can impact eating behavior. We've also looked with women how this could impact, for example, their persistence in physical exercises. We found that women who were dealing with stereotype threat were less likely to persist in physical exercises, those compared to those who were not coping with threat. We found that women were less likely to restrain their emotions. They acted more aggressively and in a hostile manner with subtle provocation after dealing with a negative stereotype. They also were more likely to make irrational decisions, poor decisions. And this is the case not just for women who are dealing with stereotype threat, but also African Americans dealing with stereotype threat. I think we found it with religious minorities dealing with stereotype threat. So it seems to be a widely felt and experienced phenomenon, and it's not just about eating, it's not just about women as well. So let me go back to that slide that I showed you earlier, where I talked to you about this data from the Center for Disease Control, where there are these discrepancies in terms of self-control between blacks and whites, such that blacks are less likely to exercise, more likely to be obese, more likely to smoke. We wonder, and this is speculative at this point, can these kinds of behaviors over time, chronically, can that lead certain groups of people to be predisposed to certain kinds of diseases? Okay? These three things that I've just listed here, these are risk factors for diabetes. All right? And if we look at this, again, nationally based sample, we see that indeed African Americans are more likely to suffer from diabetes than are white Americans. Now, I'm not sure if that's due to stereotype threat, but perhaps some of that difference is due to stereotype threat. It's an interesting question to explore in the future. So there are real effects here. There are real impacts here. They're in our minds, they're in the air, but they are definitely, definitely real and impactful. Okay, so before leaving you, I want to end on a positive note. I've been perhaps a doom and gloom prophet so far, talking about all the negative things that negative stereotypes do, and it is true. There are some pervasive effects. But can we do anything about it? I can't get into too much detail, but let me just let you know that people have been working on this, and there are things we can do, and I just want to tell you about one of them, and that is the power of role models. Okay? So imagine, just hypothetically, imagine you're walking down the hall of an Ivy League university. Probably not too hard for us to imagine in this place. Now imagine you were looking around you, looking at the photos up on the walls, and you notice something. I noticed that there are lots of these photos of esteemed people, and most of these people happen to be white. Most of these people happen to be white males. All right? We don't ignore the history of an institution, but does that have an impact? Does that shape the way we think about things? Does that shape about what, the groups we think ought to be here and the groups we think ought not to be here? Okay? What if instead, perhaps not in Harvard Law School, but in other places, we had a photo of Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's a world-famous astrophysicist, who, by the way, has got a wonderful podcast, which I recommend you all listen to. Okay? Imagine we started listening to him and hearing him and thinking, this guy's a genius. Oh, and he happens to be black as well. Now, what kind of message does that send about what blacks are capable of? Will that help black people feel like they belong, like they are welcome? And also, will that shape the kinds of stereotypes that we have about black people? What about in the halls of our esteemed engineering or mathematics departments? What if we put up a picture of Melissa Franklin, who is right here in Harvard? She's a world-class particle physicist. If we saw images of her, we thought about her in terms of when we think about science and mathematics, perhaps would be less likely to stereotype, perhaps women would feel more welcome as a result. So thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out, and thanks for having me. I'm Jennifer Gutzel, and today I'm going to talk to you about the possibility of a cross-group empathy gap. What I mean by that is that we tend to divide our social world into in-group versus out-group, us versus them. And today I'm going to show you some evidence that suggests that when we do that, when we perceive someone else as being a member of an outgroup, of being one of them, that we have a harder time empathizing with them, that we have a harder time to laugh with them, to cry with them, to feel their suffering, but also to understand their actions and other experiences. So if that's really true, is there really an empathy gap? Well, often it certainly looks like there is an empathy gap. I came across a pretty striking example of this about 1.5 years ago when the cast was finally decided on for the movie The Hunger Games. And most of you, I'm sure, know the movie, maybe you read the books. If not, the story is set in a dystopian future of the United States where every year 24 teenage contestants are randomly selected from the community, and they are put into a gigantic arena and have to fight each other to the death on national TV. The main character, Katniss, volunteers to be part of this because she wants to take the place of her little sister, who would surely die in the arena if she were to go. In the arena, Katniss meets another little girl. Her name is Rue, and Rue reminds Katniss a lot of her younger sister, and they become friends, and they work together. But at some point, poor Rue gets killed. And this is probably one of the saddest moments in the books and the movie. And I want to show you how Rue is described in the books. A 12-year-old girl from District 11. She has dark brown skin and eyes, but other than that, she's very like Prim, her little sister, in size and demeanor. So dark brown skin and dark brown eyes. Given this description, it is really likely that Rue was supposed to be African American. She might have been perceived as South Asian, but definitely not white. And the casting team also thought that. And so they casted Amanda Sternberg for it. So I show you a picture of her. And I always thought that she fit the description really well. That's how I imagined Rue. But many people didn't, and they were surprised and shocked about the casting decision. So when you looked at Twitter during that time, you would maybe happen to see comments like this. To all my Hunger Game readers out there, did anyone picture Rue as being black? No offense or anything, but I just didn't see her like that. And then another person responded, nah, I just pictured her darker skin, didn't really take it all the way to black. So certainly there is some racism going on here. But what I found most shocking and most interesting were comments like the last one here. Call me racist, but when I found out Rue was black, her death wasn't as sad anymore. So just take a moment. This person read the books. He probably fell in love with little Rue as most of us. He worried about her, maybe cried for her death, but only as long as he could picture a white girl. Now that it turns out that she's black, her death isn't as sad anymore. So is it really true that there is an empathy gap, that we feel less empathy for outgroup members? Before we can answer that question, we have to first understand how people empathize with others in general. And we know from the neurosciences that people, at least in part, empathize with others by simulating the other's experiences in their own brains. We understand other people's actions and intentions and emotions because our brain simulates what we see in others. So for example, imagine you got great tickets for a dance show, and you're sitting in the first row, and you can see every movement of the dancers, and you can see the joy in their face while dancing. If we would be able to take a look at your brain at that very moment, your brain would look, you would see that your brain is activated very similarly as it would be if you yourself were to do the dance routine. And by simulating what the dancers are doing on the stage, you can sort of gain an intuitive understanding of what it would be like to do this dance, of the joy of dancing. And you can easily get a first-hand experience of the consequences of neural resonance. That is odd. Okay, so I was going to show you a picture of someone laughing, so I'm just going to enact it. When you see someone laughing, you just have the urge to also laugh. you know? And when you see someone being really sad, telling you a sad story, you're just looking at them, even if you don't know why they're sad, you feel the sadness. If you would see how someone would give me an injection in my arm, you could almost feel it, wouldn't you? Or a spider crawling up my arm. You can feel these things. And that is a consequence of neuroresonance. So neuroresonance is a powerful phenomenon. I apologize, I wanted to show you a little bit more. It seems like my presentation is a little bit messed up. So we'll work with what we have. So neuroresonance is a really important phenomenon because it is so simple, and yet it is involved in so many important social processes. For example, we have good reason to believe from many studies that it is involved in empathy. So it helps us to feel with other people and to feel for other people. It helps us also to understand other people's actions and intentions. And once we have that intuitive understanding of other people's inner states, this helps us to help people and to coordinate our actions with them and to cooperate with them. So it's important to understand neuroresonance. And luckily, we have the means to measure neuroresonance. And we do that, one way to measure it is by using EEG. I think I have sort of at least a picture of what an EEG cap looks like. So when you see here, what we do is we put a cap on the head of a person, and the cap has many electrodes. And the electrodes can pick up on the electrical signals of our brain. So we can see which areas in the brain are activated when someone is performing an action, when they're experiencing something, but also when they see someone else performing an action or seeing someone else experiencing pain, for example. So with this tool in hand, we wanted to go about and do a research project on whether the empathy gap really exists. And what we did is we invited white undergraduates into our lab, and then we showed them videos of in-group members and out-group members performing an action. So the action was really simple. People were just taking a glass of water, putting it back down over and over again, drinking over and over again. So very simple actions. So why show people simple actions like this? I hope I can show you. Oh, God, this is terrible. Okay. Let me just quickly, maybe if I move on, I'll find my slides that I wanted to show you. Okay, this is the one that I wanted to show you right now. So why show people actions and not something more complex, like more complex emotions? Well, it's because we know so much about actions. We know from previous research exactly where in the brain actions are produced. Where does our brain control our movements? And we know that this so-called motor area, we can find it here on the top of our head. And so we know exactly where to look for activation in our, when we are recording brain activity with our EEG. And it's also really easy to find because it's bright red, and so no problem. So, no, obviously not. But we know exactly where we find that activity. And so someone who would resonate a lot with other people, who would really empathize with the actions of others, we would expect them to show activity in that area, even when they sit completely still, simply observing someone else performing the action. And so that's what we were interested in our study, and I'm just going to quickly show you data. So what you can see here, the higher the bars, the more activity people show in that area in the brain that I just showed you. The more, that means the more that they resonate. And you can see here the purple bar represents activity when people look at in-group members, white people looking at white people performing an action. And the green bar when people look at outgroup members performing an action. And you can see clearly that people show much less resonance when they look at in-group member than when they look at outgroup members. So think about it. These people sit there completely still, simply observing. They're not moving any muscles, but their brain looks like as if they would perform the action themselves. They resonate with in-group members, gaining an intuitive understanding of their actions and intentions. But they don't do that with outgroup members. So this is clearly evidence for the empathy gap. We resonate with in-group members, but we don't resonate with outgroup members. And this could potentially affect how we relate to outgroup members, how we interact with them, and then eventually how we, whether we can cooperate with them. And the empathy gap is even wider, and it seems to extend to many other domains as well. So for example, a group of researchers at Beijing University, they did a similar study, but they looked at neural resonance for pain. And what they found was that people resonate, they show activity in the same areas when they experience pain themselves. So these poor participants got stung with a needle into their hand, so nothing that I would want to be part of. But I'm glad that some people volunteered to do that because their findings are interesting. So they resonate with in-group members' pain, but they don't resonate with the pain of out-group members. And the same thing happens when you look at emotional pain. For example, in one of our studies, we found that people resonate with sad in-group members, but they don't resonate with sad out-group members. So we see that over and over again in many different domains. And this lack of neural resonance might have some serious consequences. For example, a group of researchers in Switzerland, they found a link between the amount of neural resonance and the amount of helping. So what they did more specifically is they gave people the opportunity to help in-group members and out-group members who were suffering. These people supposedly received electric shocks. And so they got the opportunity to help those people. But before that, they measured the brain activity when they were observing these people getting shocks. And what they found was, first of all, people were less likely to help out-group members than in-group members, which is interesting by itself, and quite shocking, actually. But what I personally found very interesting, because of the area that I'm interested in, is it was related to the amount of neural resonance. When a person looked at an out-group member and resonated with them, they were more likely to help them. But it also means that we don't resonate usually with out-group members, and because we don't, we also are less likely to help them when they are in need. So that is a problem. And as researchers, we are now starting to think about a possible solution. What could we do so that people would start to resonate with out-group members, so that then in the end, they might be able to cooperate with them, help them out when they are in need. And so one thing that seems to work is to actively take the perspective of an out-group member. You know, as we have seen before, naturally, as a default, it doesn't come to us intuitively and automatically to put ourselves in the shoes of an out-group member, you know, through neural resonance. But what if we actively would put our mind to it? If we would make the effort and really take the perspective of an out-group member? So that's what we wanted to test in another study that we did. And what we did specifically, we invited, again, white undergraduate students into our lab. But this time, the first thing that we did, we showed them an image of a black student, and we asked them to take the perspective of the black student while writing a story about a day in life of that student. And one half of the participants, we asked to really take the perspective, to really think about what he might be thinking and feeling, and to write the story in first person. So a participant in this group might write something like the first paragraph. My alarm went off at 8 o'clock, It took me a while to get up because I still felt so tired and dreaded going to school. Then the second half of participants, we told, don't get involved in anything what this person might be thinking or feeling. Stay as objective as possible. And a participant in this part of the study would maybe write something like, the alarm went off at 8 o'clock. He hit the snooze button several times before he got up to get ready for school. And so after we had them do this, we hooked them up to our EEG system so that they could, that we could see their brain activity. And then we showed them again the videos of in-group and out-group members performing that water drinking action that I described before. And so here now you see, again, a similar graph as before. The higher the bars, the more neural resonance people show, the more activity in the motor area. And you can see here, this is the in-group. So pretty much they're resonating as before we saw. And this is the out-group, the red bar. So when out-group members, so people don't seem to resonate with out-group members. But this changes dramatically. We don't find the same empathy gap anymore when after people took the perspective of an out-group member. You can see here, these bars are almost the same. And this is not the same person. You know, they took the perspective of one out-group member, and then several minutes later, they look at other out-group members, and we still find this. The empathy gap is no longer there. So taking the perspective of an out-group member, taking the time to do that, seems to work. So what I told you today is that first, as a default, we don't seem to resonate with out-group members. And that might negatively affect how we can relate to other people, to out-group members, how we interact with them, how we cooperate with them, whether we help them or not. But I also told you that when we take the perspective of an out-group member, when we make this extra effort, then that might help to bring us closer to the outgroup, to connect us with the outgroup. And also, it makes us resonate with outgroup members, giving us this intuitive understanding of the other that is so important for empathy. So next time, when you watch the news, maybe take the time and think about what it would be like to be in a country where there's war. When next time you cross the street and you see the homeless person in the street corner, maybe just hold on for a second and think about how it might feel like to live on the streets, to be cold, to go hungry once in a while. Or when you see someone being treated poorly just because they look differently or because they believe in a different religion, maybe put yourself in their shoes and think how it would feel to be the victim of racism or discrimination. If you can do that, maybe then neural resonance will come to you more easily next time when you see someone who's not a member of your group. And then, this is important because this would give you this intuitive understanding that you need, and that might just give you the motivation to maybe make that donation, maybe give to that homeless person, or go out on the street and raise your voice for those who don't have a voice. Or maybe it might just be as simple as that you can relate more easily to outgroup members. And that, in the end, you might just make a fantastic new friend. And also, when you then go to see the movie, The Hunger Games, and you can relate to Little Rue, I'm sure that you enjoy the movie much, much more then. Thank you.
We've been talking about identities. My names are actually an important part of our identities. My name's Binna Kandola. I was doing some research a few years ago. I'm a psychologist. I was doing some research a few years ago, and I had to issue some questionnaires to a group of students. One of the tools of a psychologist is you test and then you retest. Right? So I went to this college, I tested the students, and a few months later I came back. I was testing the same students again. The principal, who I'd met before, was introducing me to the two lecturers whose session I was about to interrupt. And he said, "This is Janet, and this is James, and I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Tanduri." And their mouths dropped open, and I thought, I better put him straight here. I said, actually, my name's not Tandoori. My name's not Tandoori. It's Candola. It's chicken Candola. We can all make mistakes. I'm a psychologist. I work with organizations. One of the things I noticed, I work in the diversity area, one of the things I noticed a few years ago now was that our clients were coming up to us and saying they've been working in the diversity field for 10, 15 years. They'd made progress. But if they'd have thought about it 10 or 15 years before, they probably would have liked to have made more progress than they had done. And this was universal. It didn't matter about the sector. It was public or private. It didn't matter. It was manufacturing. It was finance. It was everywhere. And I thought there's clearly something going on here. There's something getting in the way. And I thought this is worth investigating a bit further. So I did a big literature review, did some studies, and it quickly became apparent that there is a problem. And the problem is us. We're the problem. And the problem is we're all biased, without exception. So there are 7 billion people on the planet, and there's 7 billion people who have bias of some shape or form. The world is not divided up into those people who have bias and those who don't. It is divided up, though, into those people who recognize they have bias and those people who think they have none. And ironically, and the work on unconscious bias is full of ironies, one of the ironies is that those people who believe they have no bias probably are the most biased, because there's no reflection going on. If I believed I had no bias, why on earth would I ever need to reflect on my behavior, review my decisions, or change anything about myself, because I am perfectly content in what I'm doing? So what I want to do in this session is actually just introduce you to how the biases we're talking about apply in organizations and some of the things that we can do perhaps to minimize the effects of some of the biases that we have. So there are 2 lines there, 2 orange lines. There's a small one in the middle between the 3 blocks, and there's a thicker one at the top. Which one looks longer to you? Top one, yeah, the top one looks longer. It's not going to help this, but because it looks like it gets smaller as it goes down. But they are in fact the same size, right? They're the same size. The illusion works, and I know they're the same size because when my assistant did it for me, she said, "Is this what you want?" And I said, "No, they're meant to be the same size." I actually measured them, so I can assure you they are the same size. And the converging lines means that we automatically turn that 2-dimensional image into a 3-dimensional one. It's automatic. We can't help it. And if something is further away and it looks like it's the same size as something that's closer, it must, by definition, be bigger. Right? So we interpret it the whole time. We did a study 3 years ago. We asked people to take part in a psychology experiment. They walked into the room. At the bottom end of the room was a counter with somebody standing behind the counter with a sign above them saying, "Experiment." They walk over to the counter where they're handed a consent form. They complete the consent form, hand it back to the person behind the counter who says, "Oh, I need to staple this." They duck down underneath the counter, staple the form, come back up, give it back to the person, say, "Can you go to the room over there, please?" What they didn't realize was that was the beginning and the end of our experiment. Right? That was the beginning and the end of our experiment. The person who went down underneath the table was not the same person who came up. And the room over there, people were asked, "What did you notice?" And people noticed the counter, noticed the form, the staple, the sign that said experiment. But something like 80% of the time, people did not notice it was a different person. They did not notice it was different. Doesn't sound credible, this, but it is true. They didn't notice. And it wasn't like we used identical twins. They were 2 different people. We had them wearing similar clothes to begin with, but in the end, we had them wearing very different clothes. But there were 2 changes that we could never make without them noticing. We could never change their gender or their color without the other person noticing. We notice some difference more than others. It's automatic. It's like that. We just notice. Noticing isn't necessarily bad, but as we've heard, actually there are associations of stereotypes associated with different groups, and the groups. The difference we notice more than others are colour, gender, age, and physical disability, and clearly they're related to the visual cues that we're picking up on. But we notice difference, and the difference actually has associations with them, which are related to stereotypes. Who's that? Yeah, it's Barack Obama, it's your president, upside down. Kind of is, and but to paraphrase some British comedians, he's got all the right features, just not necessarily in the right order. His mouth and his eyes were in fact the right way up the first time. When he was upside down, his mouth and his eyes were in fact the right way up. They are now upside down. And there are 2 things going on here. One, we're very quick decision makers. Once we made a decision about something, we stopped scanning. All right, we've made our minds up, we stopped scanning. So we're not processing anymore. And secondly, it's about experience and expectations. We never experienced him looking like this, and so we don't expect it. We create, in effect, a self-fulfilling prophecy. So in interviews, for example, we know that untrained interviewers will make their minds up about a candidate within the first 2 minutes. And clearly they're basing it on some physical characteristics. It may be colour, gender, age, disability, the points I was making a moment ago. But it may be related to other things. It may be the grip. When you shake hands, how firm is that handshake? We like people who do give us a firm handshake and look you straight in the eye. I was in Canada earlier this year. I was told that First Nation people, some First Nation groups in Canada, are told it's disrespectful to shake somebody hard by the hand. So we're making these very quick, superficial judgments about people, which may not be accurate. The second thing is about experience and expectations. Women can't park a car. All right? Can't parallel park, can't reverse park. Lack of spatial reasoning means you can't do it. All right? So I was in my local supermarket on Saturday, and somebody's taking 12 goes to reverse park into that bay. I'm thinking, why don't you just give it to your husband? Then you drive past, you can see it is a man behind the wheel, and you think, what sort of man are you? Now, a piece of research was published last year in Britain on this topic of parking. And you've got two groups of people asked to park a car. The women in the first group are told, we know you can't park. We know you can't park, lack of spatial reasoning and all that. We know you can't park. Just do the best you can. It's only cones. You'll never damage the car. You'll never damage the car. And if you flatten a cone, we'll replace it with another one. We've got loads more available. Right? Do the best you can. The women in the second group are told, all this stuff you've heard about lack of spatial reasoning and women can't park a car, it's all a load of rubbish. You can park a car just as well as any man. So why don't you prove everybody wrong? So you've got prove everybody wrong versus do the best you can. And the women in the second group not only performed as well as the men, they actually outperformed the men. Whereas the women in the first group actually significantly underperformed. So we can create our own self-fulfilling prophecies. We can actually, by our own expectations, we can impact other people's behavior and see what we're expecting to see. Now, in this particular image here, a lot of people see there's one predominant image that people see here. Sometimes people see more than one thing. Sometimes people don't see the most dominant thing. They see other things. What do you see? A dog? Yeah. Yeah. There's a dog. A lot of people see a dog. I was with a group recently, and nearly everybody in the room could see a dog. And one of their colleagues couldn't see a dog, and another one of his colleagues helped him out and said, of course you can see the dog. It's below the whale. Now, strictly speaking, there's no outline of anything there. And there's two things going on here. One, we don't like random. We're always trying to make sense of the world around us. And secondly, I told you there was something there to be seen. Right? I told you there was something there to be seen. And I create a motivation or a goal in you to start searching for something. And it's an example of what's known as priming. And priming are the ways in which we can be influenced without realizing that we have been influenced. It's the ways in which we can be influenced without realizing that we have been influenced. So French psychologists had two groups of interviewers about to interview the same people, right? They're interviewing the same candidates. One group of people is told, go and meet your candidate, bring them back to your office, and then when you're finished, escort them from the premises. The other group of people is told, meeting the same people, remember, are told, go and meet your elderly candidate, bring them back to your office, and when you're finished, escort them from the premises. And what they found was the people who thought they were going to be meeting an elderly candidate actually walked more slowly to meet them. Their behavior had changed. Their behavior had changed even before they'd met the people. And there was clearly a set of associations that they were making, elderly, aged, infirm, slow, I'd better slow down. And whether those associations were conscious or unconscious, they were clearly being made or impacting, and actually having an impact on their behavior. So priming is another way. So we've got two sources of bias. Rather, we notice difference, and we notice some differences more than others. And secondly, about the way that we interpret the world around us. Now, there's a football team, a soccer team that I support. It's called Aston Villa. Right? You may not have heard of them, but we did win the European Championship in 1982. Our local rivals are a team called Birmingham City. They're 2 miles away. All right? We're literally next door to one another. So our local rival is a team called Birmingham City. Intellectually, I know that the fans must be the same. It's the same catchment area, it's the same city, basically the same people. We must be the same. Intellectually, I know that. Emotionally, I know we are better than them. And not only that, my children know it too. I think it's one of the proudest achievements I've had as a parent. Anyway, we form groups. We're very social animals. So the third area of bias is about the way that we form groups. We form in groups and out groups. The groups that we're part of clearly are in groups, and then by definition the other groups are our out groups. And there's some very interesting things that happen. We actually view our in-group differently from the out-group. So we actually view them differently in the sense that we see people in the in-group as individuals, and we accept difference. We actually think about them differently. So actually we are more likely to remember the positive contributions from in-group members, and we're more likely to remember the things that they do. And thirdly, we behave differently towards in-group members. We are more likely to make sacrifices, and we're more likely to be helpful towards other in-group members. And we view out-groups, consequently, in a very different way. So out-groups are viewed as being homogeneous. They are all the same. We minimize difference. The French, ... Right, you complete that sentence in your heads. It doesn't matter whether you finish that sentence positively or negatively, the French will have been treated as a homogeneous group of people. They are all the same. We will remember the negative things they've done, we will forget their contributions, and generally speaking, we won't be so helpful towards them. Now, this can have an impact in terms of societies. It can also have an impact in teams. In a team, you could actually get groups of people who create in-groups and out-groups within your teams, and it may be that we value the contributions of some people more than others. We don't listen to people and actually miss out on the talent that's available to us. So what can we do? Well, one of the things that we can do is actually turn the mirror on ourselves. Instead of thinking that bias is somebody else's problem, which is what we tend to do, it's actually a problem for me. One of the things we can do to increase our self-awareness is actually to do some tests of unconscious bias. One of them developed, it's actually on the Harvard website, one of the academics who developed it, it's actually here at Harvard, but there's two other academics who developed this as well. It's called the implicit association test. If you Google IAT, it will take you to the test. It's easier to do than to describe, but it's a reaction time test. Basically, stimuli come on the screen and you react as quickly as you can. Right, you go, right? And I did this for the first time 10 years ago. In the United Kingdom, I'm described as an Asian person. So people from the Indian subcontinent are described as Asian. And I did the first test I gravitated towards for kind of obvious reasons was Asian and white faces and good and bad words. Asian and white faces, good and bad words, they come up on the screen, you react as quickly as you can. Just to go over my background again, I am a psychologist. It is a science, very rigorous, highly methodical, very analytical, highly statistical. And I also work in the diversity field, so not judging people, not stereotyping them, not making assumptions. So essentially, the fairest person in Britain. I took this test. And it gave me a result at the end. It said that I had a bias associating Asian people with good, right? Which never surprises anybody, but which really shocked me. So given my background, education, experience and training, I did exactly what you'd expect me to do in the circumstances. I went, okay, best of 3. So I did it again. I got the same result, best of 5. I got the same result. I did it 3 times in a row, and I got the same result 3 times. And I walked away from my desk thinking, what a load of rubbish. What a load of rubbish. I'm clearly the fairest person in Britain. And that test did not validate it, so the test has to be wrong. The next day, we were making a DVD. I was in studios in North London. 7 actors, didn't know them. We broke for lunch. There's a table with sandwiches on there. And just chairs scattered around the room. I picked up a sandwich, sat down, and next to one of the actors. And as soon as I sat down, I realized I'd parked myself next to the only other Asian person in the room. All right? Now, my act was unconscious. At no point did I think, aha, Asian person. I must go and sit next to him. My act was unconscious, but also it was not random. Unconscious, but not random. I may not be aware of it, but something impelled me to go in one direction rather than another. And just that self-awareness is actually an important first step in kind of tackling things to do with bias. And the second area, ridiculous as it may seem, is actually just to tell ourselves not to do it. Just tell ourselves to stop. I am not going to do it. It takes a conscious effort. The unconscious processes are obviously wearing away, but through a conscious effort, we can actually make ourselves stop. I am not going to stereotype. You can actually, or you can. One of the things that we've done actually, we say actually set fairness as a goal. When you're making decisions, set fairness as a goal, and we found that can reduce the levels of unconscious biases exhibited by a group of people. And you can take it a step further. Give yourself an instruction. When I am doing these interviews, then I will try my hardest to be as objective as possible. or when I'm doing interviews, then I will not stereotype. Those when-then statements we found to be very powerful. It's actually found that you can reduce unconscious bias by those mechanisms as well. It's very simple things. I mean, lots of other things that you can do. I'm just concentrating on some of the more straightforward things that we can undertake. So we can turn the mirror on ourselves, tell ourselves to stop, and instruct ourselves to be fair and set fairness as a goal. And the final point, essentially, is about everybody taking responsibility for this. There is a particular responsibility for leaders to role model the behaviour. If a leader can actually talk about topics like bias, actually role model the behaviour that they're expecting other people, it has a huge impact on other people. But we can also challenge one another. I know it can be difficult in some circumstances, so maybe not challenge on our own, maybe get some allies with us and actually challenge collectively. But actually this challenge and questioning, are we being fair here? Challenge doesn't have to be unpleasant. It may be just like telling a story. It may be asking a question. It doesn't have to be aggressive. But this process of challenging is actually important, can make us rethink our decisions. I did some work with an accountancy firm a couple of years ago, 6 partners, about to make promotion decisions the next day. And I met with them and told them about the stuff about bias. I subsequently found out that there was one candidate who met all of the criteria, who 5 out of the 6 was going to reject. Met all of the criteria, 5 out of 6 were going to reject him. And the 6th one said, well, why are we turning him down? He meets all the criteria. He said, well, because he's too big. He's actually too big. He needs to lose weight. And he said, well, so you're saying if he loses 5 or 6 stones, if he would have come in 5 or 6 stones lighter, we would have appointed him. And they went, yeah, it's for his own good. So if he loses the weight, comes back next year, we'll appoint him. And I said, but what about all that training we did at Bias yesterday? He said, yeah, well, that's about women and minorities, isn't it? It's not about big people. But they changed their minds. He stuck to his guns. Obviously, he's in a peer group. It makes it easier. But he stuck to his guns, and they actually did appoint him. So challenge. So there are three kind of areas of bias that operate in organizations. One is we notice difference, and there are associations, and there's some difference we notice more than others, and there are associations and stereotypes associated with those particular groups. Secondly, is the way we interpret the world around us, priming, quick decision-making, experience and expectations. And thirdly, it's about the way that we socialize in groups. And we have a different set of expectations for in-groups than we do for out-groups. And there are 3 things that we can do. Lots of other things, but 3 that we could do immediately. One is that we can turn the mirror on ourselves. Instead of blaming other people, actually just kind of reflect on our own behavior, increasing our self-awareness. It can make a difference. Secondly, we can actually just tell ourselves not to do it. Consciously try not to display bias in decisions we're making. And the third thing we can do is actually to challenge in an appropriate manner people around us, get us to review decisions, and leaders in particular have a higher role here in terms of being role models to other people in the organisation. So finally, I just want to leave you with the thoughts of a British broadcaster and comedian, Jeremy Hardy. He did a programme about prejudice, and he was looking at various phobias, Islamophobia, xenophobia, homophobia, amongst others. And he's made the point, actually, that these fears and these hatreds are genuinely felt. They are feelings that are genuinely felt. But all phobias are genuinely felt. There are, in fact, people who have a fear of buttons. Believe it or not, there are people who have a fear of buttons. And he points out that actually, and of course this is a genuine fear that they have, and we shouldn't revile them for having this particular phobia, but we should gently point out to them that whilst they may have this fear of buttons, the fault actually lies with them and not with the buttons. Thank you. Thank you.